Welcome to Dayton Warcry Club. I'm Warren, and today I'm joined by my co-host Fred and a special guest Dan from TheSaltySea. Today we'll be continuing a little with our talk about Warcry stats and how you might use them to build lists in Warcry 2.0. We'll also have local event coverage as well as news for 3 upcoming local events in the area. All right, hey guys, how's it going?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be on. I've been listening to you guys for a long time, obviously, but excited for my first ever appearance.
Likewise, in reverse, I'm really glad to have you here. Obviously, when we were first getting started into Warcry, your channel was one of the primary resources that as a group we kind of used to kind of build out our theory. So I'm very excited to have you here on the show.
Yeah, it's
Thank
exciting
you.
for me too because, for the longest time, you're pretty much the only game or the biggest game in town for Warcry content. And then we started, and I had met you at Adepticon earlier this year. And at the time, I was like, okay, the dream, right? I'm living the dream right now, right, dude? So do a collab with TheSaltySea. So I don't know what we do after this. I think we've peaked.
I think the only way you could achieve sort of greater apotheosis would be if you somehow convinced Rito to rejoin the content game. I think
Absolutely,
that could do it.
Mm-hmm.
that would do it. That'd be the next step.
So we first off, we kind of do a little bit of intro here. We'll be talking about local events and kind of some hobby stuff. We'll be talking a little bit about a follow up from our last video, talking about MathHammer. And then we'll also get into list building guidelines and then upcoming events. But first off, so introductions. So what we do for any guest that we have on who hasn't been on before, anyone who's listening to us has probably heard of you already, but kind of just introduce yourself, like your gaming background. Like we know you kind of come, the other games you play that kind of shaped your entry into the hobby and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I'm Dan. I came into the sort of war hamster space from Magic the Gathering, where I had I was kind of a Johnny at heart in that game, and the game doesn't really give you a ton of avenues for self-expression. Still a great game. I still play a ton of Magic, but I had tried kind of altering some of my own cards, and that was too hard. And eventually decided, maybe I would try out these whole painting miniatures games. It was especially interesting because, you know, Magic, especially in the last 5 years or so, has kind of struggled to maintain the goodwill of its fans. Some
Yeah.
months you just hate the game, some months you're back in. Um, and so, Warhammer started as like a great outlet for when I was kind of angry at the game or not enjoying Magic. And then I just kind of fell in love with skirmish gaming as a concept because I get sick of color schemes um, pretty quick. About like 800, 900 points into an army, I get sick of the color scheme and don't want to paint it anymore. Uh, but 900 points of an army is like a perfect have every option for Warcry amount, you know? So Warcry became this like perfect fit hobby-wise for me, and that's kind of what got me into it. And then sort of looking out online because I like to kind of maybe listen to a podcast or watch a YouTube video of the game I'm playing while I'm getting ready to do it. I do this with Magic too. When I'm brewing a deck, I listen to a podcast about Magic. Kind of puts me in the same headspace. And I was just shocked at, there's at the time there were only 2 content creators making things about Warcry. So I was like, well, um, once I get a few games in, I should just kind of make the kinds of videos that I wished existed when I was painting. And that's how I ended up here.
You gave us a lot of like inspiration to like our early war bands, or a lot of the things that we did early on in the game were kind of based on what you did. And again, we're a bunch of semi-retired legacy Magic players too, so
Yeah, I've been playing Magic for like 28 years, and this is the most retired I've ever been. But all I do all day while I'm working is watch Magic videos still. So you can never get 100% away from it.
Yeah. It's a good game at pulling you back in.
Yes, I've sold my complete collection like 4 times, and it's never lasted more than a couple of months before I'm like, I'll just build one deck and I'll have it if I ever want to
Yep.
play again, and then it goes from there, and et cetera, et cetera. So
I was chatting with a buddy actually. I'm going to some events for just hangouts. In the at least next weekend, and then maybe even next month as well. Just go and cube or whatever.
I do love me some Cube.
yeah, Warren's collection is truly astonishing. If he sold out, he'd be all right. But mine was never quite that good. But yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Enough about that other game though. We're here to talk about Warcry. So speaking of Warcry, we hadn't done a reaction on the new set, but yeah, this looks great.
It looks really good. It's the one I'm most excited about in a long time, as far as like Chaos Cultist oriented releases, which there's a lot of them, and like they kind of blend together in a lot of ways. But these are 2 really distinct and interesting looking warbands to me.
Yeah, everyone I know wants the Lizardmen. I think so. I don't know how this box split's going to work. I know Zach wants them. I know Joel wants them. I ran into Chad earlier today. He wants them, and one of the other local guys, Greg, wants them too. So there's not enough boxes to go around. They're probably have to wait for them to get offered separately.
I'll do a split of the Zinch guys if you want, because I'm going to get this for both warbands, but I'll only have one of the new Zinch cultists, and they're my favorite. So if you've got a bunch of people over there who want Seraphon, I'm definitely looking for set number 2 of the Zinch.
Ooh, we might be able to work that out.
Because I just think they're so cool. I mean,
I think the Zinch guys are very cool too.
Yeah, and there's this way where they've gone half and half between 2 different real world cultures that are totally different. Like they've got a lot of like the hoods and the robes of like European warrior monk traditions, but then they've got like a lot of the jade pieces, like the jade masks are an Olmec thing. Like they've got a lot of Mesoamerican stuff in there too. So like flipping them together makes it feel like a fully realized culture without like feeling derivative of either place. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel like they just lifted it from one culture the way, I don't know, like Ideneth are kind of lifted from Athenian Greeks or something, whereas yeah.
And not only that, because I agree with you that they're striking and distinctive, but they're also not just a bunch of shirtless barbarians again, which we have so many options for.
Yep.
Like if you want like your Conan type wasteland warriors, you have like 1,000 different models to choose from, and it's cool to do something very different than that for a chaos cultist band. Like even like the spiders guys are still like, they have like tridents and nets and whatever, and they're a little different, but these guys are straying really far from that formula, and I'm really excited about it. The skinks are really cool too, though.
Yeah, and then train wise, it's brown wastes again. I was chatting earlier, so I think there's some sprues reused, maybe some new sprues, maybe using a different configuration, but I don't have this terrain yet, and we'll be doing this a jungle mat in the paint scheme of Zach's Gura terrain. So we'll make this a jungle or a swamp, and it'll be sweet looking.
Yeah, it's a little more green, which again, we have a lot of shirtless barbarians and we have a lot of brown wastes for them to fight on. Like something a little different every once in a while is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I liked Conan too, but we only need so much of it.
Exactly.
So speaking of Conan dudes, so we had our event. This is over a month ago now. So October 2nd, we had 6 players show up for 3 rounds of organized play. So this was our second meetup, a little bit smaller turnout, and we kind of turned into a semi-formal tournament. It was sort of me learning the Best Coast Pairings app to kind of learn the ins and outs of that, kind of see what worked and what didn't for flipping up cards, using the match play cards from Heart of Gur to kind of see, instead of using the 6 set match play missions, So we had different missions going on across the board. It was better. It was okay. There was still some non-interactive games because of those, and so going forward, I'm probably going to stick to like the 6 match play missions in the core book, and just have everybody play the same ones. Yeah, but we had pretty good spread. But here's our results. So a couple lists we'll discuss here. So Chad with Nurgle Demons, not a lot of models.
2 chimeras.
Yeah, 2 chimeras, and then our very own Dave, who couldn't be here tonight, second place with Slaves of Darkness. So also playing Chimera. And so the headline here is, so actually the Chimeras went a combined 6-0 in games played. Chad and Dave played first round, and Dave did not have a Chimera list, and he got crushed. And since this was kind of like an informal open play session, if you wanted to change lists or adjust your list between rounds, I was like, yeah, hey, cool, that's fine, go ahead. So he's like brought out his Chimera, and then he just crushed everyone else. And then I think the last game he played, it was blood marked, and so that game was over on turn 1.
Yes.
And so we got another game in and won that one. So yes, out of all the games played, Chimeras won a combined 6-0. I played Chad in the 3rd round. And I got crushed as well. I just had no way. I was playing 1 box Untamed Beasts, and really had no way to compete.
And the thing to look at here is Dave's list, I think, is tunable. I think you could go down that road, and in fact, we've kicked around some lists that are pretty close to this. But like, for example, I'm not a huge fan of the Exalted Hero of Chaos, and like Exalted Deathbringer in that slot, or you could upgrade the Dark Oath Warcry to an Exalted Deathbringer because you have the points, and the list gets even better. So yeah, I don't think we've even seen like peak Chimera on these lists yet.
Yeah, I know. I think we started kicking around Exalted Deathbringer based on your suggestion, Dan. Probably after this. Yeah, and as I was writing this list down, I was like, oh, hey, there's that magic 185 number, and there's a lot of good stuff you can put in at that 185 point.
Yeah, and I just feel like the Exalted Deathbringer does everything that all of the bespoke leaders wish they could do. That guy on the Dark Oath is pretty good as well, but for the most part, most of them are just worse versions of the Exalted Deathbringer, and I feel like it really epitomizes what that archetype is trying to be. I mean, we could go obviously one by one through them, and we don't have time. There are ones that have redeeming characteristics that are pretty solid, but in general, I just think that Khorne guy is just so nice to have.
If your goal is just to kill models with a model, he does that really well, and since it's a miniatures combat game, that's usually your goal. So he brings so much damage on demand. The Nurgle list is really interesting. I like Beasts of Nurgle.
It did some cool stuff against me.
Obviously, Plague Bearers are a fun space to play around in because they're so cheap. Yeah, I like a lot of that. I think some of the earlier lists I was looking at with Nurgle Demons of the Chimera, like you cut the Beast of Nurgle for 3 more Plague Bearers, and just like bring so many bodies to the table. But
yeah, I've been playing one with a 7 Plague Bearers and a Bringer of the Word.
Yeah,
to try lead from the back stuff with them. I've gotten to play it once, and it was pretty effective, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can kind of get to with Nurgle.
Master
as
Molder.
Your base for the Chimera.
Master Molder.
Master Molder can
5 points. 5 points cheaper, has more wounds.
Yeah, but I don't own a Master Molder.
Oh, okay.
Warren loves the Master Molder. You'll see a lot of Master Molders in Warren's lists.
He is my soul animal. We also had another, back to the pictures here. You can see in the left here. So Dustin was playing Beasts of Chaos with a he took a Cygor. Yeah, he's got a Gorgon too. But
I do too. I just went out. I have a Gorgon. I just went out and bought a Cygor. I now have like almost every monster. I've just completely hooked on them.
But he played against 2 Chimeras. unfortunately.
Yeah. And we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but I played my Cygor against Dave's this Chimera list on Halloween, and my Cygor felt really out of place. It didn't have a good role because like it had to like avoid the Chimera or was going to get gibbed. It wasn't like ready to go like toe to toe with the Chimera, and the Chimera could just kind of keep it herded where it couldn't do much. So
it's interesting. Well, I thought the theory was that, oh, hey, the Cygor can throw a rock and it can bracket it down, and the Cygor would be a good matchup against it. I thought that was the theory I was hearing.
I think that is in fact the theory, but I don't know. The Chimera can like even if down one bracket can come up and like drag and maul it and then attack it down like 2 or 3 brackets, and then you're back to losing that fight. I don't know.
So hobby update, a couple pieces of Dave's stuff in work there. And then also I've actually finally broke out the paint a couple weeks ago, and then I was actually got in the zone last night too. So I'm going to have finally now an updated 2.0 warband with some Skaven that are painted up. So I got at least one of those guys is going to be a stand-in for a Death Master, and I got some more stuff in the works as well for my 2.0 lists. So it's a start.
Awesome. Yeah, it looks good. And
then Dan, what you got on your hobby table?
I am currently painting as we speak a Sloppity Bilepiper. And as soon as I run out of this color, this Stormfiend blue, I'm going to be assembling a bunch of Wardens from Lumineth. I've never actually built or painted any Lumineth, but I've got the Warcry box here. Great little combo of units. And so, yeah, I'm just going to be putting some of those long breakable spears together.
Yes. My Lumineth list is very 1.0. I haven't updated it, so it's all Blade Lord spam, which, isn't where you want to be at the moment. So I need to get some Wardens, I think. I think that's the future of that faction.
Yeah, you're doing spears, or are you doing the hammer dudes?
I'm on 50-50 each.
Okay.
I put this up in a video, but I really like having an Achillean King with a bunch of both of them, and then a Tempest support character, and then whichever of the Lumineth leaders that's really cheap has the most utility. I think most of the Lumineth leaders in general are bad. I think right now I'm most interested in the Caligrave, but not by much. I'm not super excited about it. It's just to have a cheap leader, right?
Yeah.
And then yeah, just one deployment group where your little Stonehammer guys are being escorted by Tempest friend, and then the other deployment groups would be Warden heavy.
Yeah, I like the Achillean King. One of my, and I don't want to get ahead of us when we talk about list building theory in 2.0 is units that can try to put like big burst damage on demand. So if they have to like try to bracket down a monster or whatever, and the Achillean King is on my short list of
Storm of Blows. Yep.
Yep.
If Zach was on, yeah, it's his Star Wars Legion stuff here. But yeah, he's been busy doing some of that. Hobby wise, so we got a build party going on at his place. It might just wind up being me and Zach just building stuff. But yeah, kind of excited for that. Like anytime we do like a hobby hangout or like a paint party or whatever you want to call it, it's a good way to get stuff done. So I've been looking forward to that. I have boxes and boxes of stuff I'm taking down and looking forward to putting together.
We used to do those and watch the Star City Legacy coverage. Get together and paint and watch the Star City games. All right.
Yeah, it's but I mean, yeah, great way to if you're stuck on hobby, like find a friend and do a hobby hangout with a friend or something like that. And one good way to get back into it. But getting into the meat of the content here. So, and then I forgot to mention earlier. So if you're listening to us on Spotify, on Apple, Music or iTunes or Google Podcasts or something like that. So you couldn't see any of the awesome pictures. The best way to experience this is on our YouTube channel, but we are kind of cross broadcasting this since it's a long form podcast as well. So I'll naturally, some of the stuff we're going to be going over here on the video is not going to translate well. Apologize for that, but we're going to try to talk through as much as we can. But getting into the meat here. So if you saw our last video, we talked about like the basics of MathHammer, you know, how the stats kind of worked and, you know, kind of, you know, our way of looking at it in terms of figuring out, okay, what is the point for point most efficient units? How is that calculated? And there's a new content creator. Give a shout out to Optimal Game State on YouTube. Check them out. They do kind of like a rundown of like a subset, like Chaos Heroes or Order Heroes, and it's Salty. You've seen them too, right? It is tight. Like he
Very
managed
comprehensive, very nice. Yeah.
Pack a ton of information into 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so. You know, histogram charts and stuff like that, and that kind of inspired what what we're going to be going over here too. We got a few histogram charts as well, because we kind of want, as a follow-up, talk about, you know, what are the overall, you know, if you're trying to do stats, like what's your overall average toughness or that you have to worry about when trying to do like that weighted average. So to get into our discussion first, before we start talking about what, you know, how do you determine the weight, so kind of do a little live test of our spreadsheet here. So using the data, and then Zach's not here, but Zach did all the data entry for 2.0 for this. And this is based off of a Reddit spreadsheet from 1.0 that I think the name of the guy on Reddit was Matrinder, I think. Give him credit as well. I mean, try to make sure that he had the original formulas, and some other people have created spreadsheets like this. You probably have something like this as well, right, Dan?
I do. I've never really seen other people. I know there's been a lot of networking with these. I mostly just kind of built my own.
Most folks
kind of did the data entry myself too. It was no fun.
Most folks build their own, but here we can do something like, okay, right now we're showing everything in the game. Where you want the hardest hitters in the game? Boom, right? Chimera, Gorgons, and this is where the monsters skew all the data, right? And so now you can filter out, okay, well, let's set aside the monsters, right? Because they're kind of a special case. And now you have, all right, Storm Fiend, Tyrant Crushers, the heaviest hitters.
Yeah, that looks pretty intuitive. Those are your heavy hitters.
Yep. Or using our metric of points per effective damage, right? We have to flip it and sort smallest to largest here. And now you can see the most efficient fighters in the game, point for point, based on their average damage, right? Grave Guards, Paladins with Star Soul Maces, your move 3 guys, right, are going to be your hardest hitters point for point. And then you can see here exactly how gross Grave Guard with Great Blade is, you know, how much lower it is than everything else.
Yeah, they're in a tier all by themselves.
But one of the things that's a variable here that I kind of wanted to have you on for discussion, Dan, is like, how do we look at when you're coming up with this effective damage, how do you set the weights, right? In 1.0, we had it set up, and I think you had the same set of formulas, right? You put 40%, you assume that 40% of your fights are going to be against toughness 3, 40% against toughness 4, 20% against toughness 5. And you can see it changes some of the numbers here in this column if you change those weights, but by and large they're kind of the same. But again, us being OCD, we want to try to figure out, okay, what's the best sort of like set of weights that kind of like matches what we'd expect to see in Warcry today.
And so if you're kicking it to me, I think toughness 6 has to be in there. Now, I've seen the histograms of how many things of each toughness are in each fight or are in the whole game. The issue is that when you look at who's actually showing up to tournaments and what is actually good, man, there's a lot of toughness 6 out there.
You're going to have to fight Stormcast.
You Exactly. Your chances of never seeing a Stormcast, which all of them are 5 or 6, more of them are 5 than 6, but you
Yep.
know, no matter what, it's going to be toughness 5, toughness 6. You're just not going to get out of a tournament without facing either a Stormcast player or someone who's just got one Stormcast ally in there for giggles, right? Because there's a lot of pretty playable Stormcast heroes that can
There are so
bring
many
in.
heroes just in general. You're going
Yeah.
to find one you can fit somewhere.
So I'm really into having some T6 in there. I'm also into kind of overweighting toughness 5 compared to how much it actually appears in the entire game, right? Just because, again, that's Stormcast principle. Um, and I've also found that Iron Jaws are pretty popular. Like, just, they're a people's army. Um, and so they've got a lot of toughness 5 in there too. So I'm actually personally, and the small margins here don't matter too much, but I personally go equal weighting on 3, 4, and 5, and then 10% on 6.
Okay.
And so when you do that, I think it actually brings the Graveguard up above the Chimera. Doesn't matter too much, right? It's all pretty similar. Um, and then I've got Arcanaut with Skypike, I think is my number 3. Let's see. Oh, you're resorting.
Yep, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. But these are kind of small marginal changes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
certainly.
It's
Like
shuffling
whether or not
around the top couple without really doing anything. It's not bringing up somebody from the middle of the pack to the top or dropping somebody down significantly. But that's interesting how good the Graveguard is, which the answer to that question is very, very good. That strength 5 starts to shine as you start to weight those higher toughnesses a little bit.
but strength 5, the toughness 6. I mean, if you have strength 4, you're hitting the same versus a 5 or a 6.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, either way, they some of them, like Arcanauts with Skypike, also I think come up a little bit. Because all of those, yeah, bringing in toughness 6 really helps the strength 4 fighters to shine a little bit more.
And where you
Arcanauts
might
are so gross.
see this is one analysis that I did recently, right? Usually it's because you're looking at two different loadouts for something. And you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best loadout? And you're looking at, one is like a sword loadout with 4 attacks, strength 4. One might be like a heavier weapon loadout with 3 attacks at strength 5.
Yeah, Games Workshop loves their 3 strength 4 attacks or 4 strength 3 attack loadout swaps.
Again, they're very similar, right? And so we've kind of had this discussion, I think, so Varangard is one example, right? Like which Varangard is better? The 280 or the 285 one, or the 285 or the 291. So Krakadrak obviously is the heaviest hitter, but then you're looking at 4-4-3-5 versus 3-5-3-6, and then you can even see the breakdowns. Okay, which one performs better against each toughness level. So if you really want to get into this, you could be like, well, if I, in this case, in some cases, or against a lot of them, right, the ensorcelled weapon performs better than the Demon Forge blade. But in one instance, actually in 2 instances, the Demon Forge blade works better at T5, and slightly better at T4. But then again, at T6, again, if you're, a strength 5 hits a T6, where it is the same effectiveness versus a T6 as a strength 4, so you want the extra attack. So then again, the sword pulls out. So which one, it kind of depends on your individual matchups, like, which weapon works best against which fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, some of these, the ones that are range 2, that's just so relevant so often that I value those much more highly, even than something that kind of out damages it by a little bit. Not if it's by a ton, but just getting out damaged a little bit, I usually value the range 2 a little bit more. So like for the Achillean King, for example, it gets out damaged by the sword. The spear Achillean King is out damaged by the sword Achillean King. However, it's got that 2-inch reach, and actually the funny thing is, it out damages the sword when doing the super burst ability. It gets really close, but it's
Oh,
like
yeah,
just barely like a third of a point of damage more while using the burst ability.
right.
So it's kind of like,
Naturally having more attacks, that benefit is decreased because you're adding up to 3 attacks across the board on both profiles.
right, exactly. So it makes me like the spear one just a little bit more. I would still maybe, you know, if I was going to be a madman and bring 2 Achillean Kings, I
I
would
have
bring,
lists.
yeah, I would bring one of each because the sword one is much better at gunning down chaff, right? Because you're not going to bother, like, you don't care about getting outside of 1 inch from the chaff anyway, because you're not really afraid of the crackback, and you're not planning for it to still be alive to fight back, right? So, the 1 inch reach stops hurting you, and then you don't want to waste a dice ability killing a tiny model, right? So if I was playing 2, I'd play one of each, but if I'm only playing 1, I would go with the spear.
You can
Go ahead.
really Thundercats that faction. You can play 4 eels, 2 kings, and
Yeah, I
just go
was
to
looking at
town.
that. Uh-huh.
So you mentioned, so I spend most of my time in this spreadsheet in these columns here, looking at the effective damage, points per effective damage. I kind of tunnel visioned a little bit on that, but you mentioned there's other nuances like the having a range of 2 versus a range of 1. Mobility matters. Survivability is an even more nuanced question. We don't use this part of the spreadsheet nearly as much, but we've developed metrics here. If you're going to be talking about your survivability, how many attacks do you have to take? Can you survive from a strength 3 model? How many attacks can you survive from a strength 4 model? But to do that, you not only have to have the weights like we did before to discuss, all right, well, how often do you expect to be attacked by models of various strengths? But what isn't the average profile for those models as well? And so this is, I think, still accurate. So, this is saying that the average strength 3 fighter has about 2 attacks and about a 1.5, maybe, and then we 3 or 4 damage or crit damage. Your average strength 4 fighter is kind of like that 4-4-2-4 profile that we like to see. And so you could get really nuanced in this as well, but you're coming up with a set of numbers that could be fuzzy or have errors. You're doing calculations to come up with them. And you can come up with an overall value here that's, attacks to kill, and another survivability metric of points per attacks to kill. But I like to lean on simple formulas that are kind of easier to understand. And so this is why, like, I might lean back towards a weighting. I've seen folks that are using a weighting set of scales like 0.25, 0.5, 0.25, ignore toughness 6. You have something easy there to figure out, or a simple metric like points per wound. Like, instead of looking at points per attacks to kill, if you looked at points per wound as a metric for survivability, or just look at your overall wounds as survivability, it could be you have a lot of the same ones up top here. Granted, again, the ordering is a little bit different, but if you just wanted a very simple way to look at a fighter and say, okay, that's a 100-point fighter with 10 wounds, that's kind of glass cannon-y, and you might want to steer away from that. Versus like, oh, this is a 15 wound fighter at 75 points. You look at that like a Sangor and be like, oh, that's a tanky piece of chaff. That's going to be hard to shift.
So I've actually started valuing survivability for my cheap models like very, very highly. Specifically just because I don't want them, if I'm playing something specifically to have activations, I don't want my opponent to have a really easy time just blowing it off the board.
Yes.
And so I put some work in to kind of decide like you said, I don't like having a really complicated thing to look at. So all my MathHammer is set up to do, um, like for example, you have points per effective damage here. I've divided them all by an amount so that every model is just rated 1 through 10. And I've done the same thing with my kind of toughness stuff. So
Mhm.
like what I did was I figured out what weight I wanted to do for damage efficiency, right?
Yep.
Lots of different valid opinions for how you're going to weight it. But once I had the weight that I liked, I just took um, the 400 most damage efficient models, and I figured there are plenty of really good fighters that aren't on this list, but you're usually taking them for other reasons. So I'm not that worried about surviving the attacks from them. And so then I just looked at the number of attacks it would take to kill a 20 wound model at a bunch of different toughnesses. And then I derived a formula so that the rating of the 20 wound model that is in this case 200 points of that toughness would be equal relatively to the number of attacks it was doing, and then just spat that formula out across the whole range to get something that, at least right now, kind of gives them all a relative score to each other based on the fighters that I'm afraid of, but not the whole game
Yeah.
worth of
Yeah.
fighters.
Yeah, you're right. Because we have something like 800 different profiles here, but yes, in reality, you're only going to be seeing maybe 100 or 200 different profiles because no one's taken, stuff is included there for sake of completeness, but no one takes those models.
Right, right. So I had a lot of fun doing that, to be honest. I'm looking for what I've got as my tankiest models, but it doesn't matter too much.
Yeah,
Um,
this is really what I want to talk about, the different approaches. And I got a slide talking about this later too, but typically I go so far on this, and then after a certain point, I'm just like, okay, I have a good idea of what's good, like how killy it is or how survivable it is. And then, all right, now it's time to now that I have my list of candidates, now it's time to make a list. And there's like, the general principles of list building that we have.
Absolutely. So do you want to mosey on over to us kicking a bunch of list ideas around at each other?
Well, I got a few more graphs here. Let's get back to the slides just to kind of cover.
We got to get through all the graphs first.
We got to get through. Yeah, we got graphs here. So I built some histograms based on our data. I forgot to edit the slides. So the x-axes are pretty rough, but here you can see, let me get the pen out. I teach this way too, if I'm teaching distance learning stuff. So this is toughness 2. This is toughness 3, toughness 4, toughness 5 here. And then these are the different wound values. So here you have, this line is 6, 8, 10, 12. But yes, just some general histogram. Here you can see the bulk of the if you look at the entire population of fighter profiles, heroes and and fighters included, it's a lot of toughness 4, which kind of leads credence to that, building some sort of bell curve for your weights around toughness 4 there. And again, a significant number of toughness 6s, right? 42 models in the game with toughness 6.
Yeah, that's actually more than I would have thought. And of course, the hilarious toughness 7 models they've sprinkled in there.
Yep. And then you can see, look again, 20 wounds being very popular. A lot of 10 to 12 wound models in the hit points chart. 58 wound models, 80 10 wound models, 86 12 wound models. And I think I got a slide here. I cover the toughness one, but not the. I don't cover the wounds, but if you remember, like the typical chaff profile that we saw in 1.0, if you're raiding a dragon, what was your chance of killing a toughness 3 8 wound model? There's a lot fewer of those toughness 3 8 wound models out there that people are playing.
Yep.
They've,
The game's evolving upwards, like in the new stats. Like there's a lot more 10 wounders and 12 wounders out there. You're not one-shotting chaff models with dragons anymore, unless you're spending a lot of points on that dragon.
and of course they've increased the points on those flying killing machines too.
Yep.
So there's a little bit of an imbalance there.
Yep, and this has an effect on what we see in lists, right? In model numbers for lists as well.
Yep.
Here's a real quick comparison, just versus 1.0 toughness versus 2.0 toughness. Again, here you can see the numbers overall, right? Fewer toughness 3 fighters. Again, the Underworlds guys are out of this, but again, a slight shift over into the into more toughness 4 than toughness 3.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's cool. And yeah, I mean, you guys covered it, but the big takeaway being, the age of dragons being like the only valid answer to every question is certainly over. There's a lot of them that are still really good, but what was it at Adepticon? Every single person in position to play for 3-1, not everyone who got 3-1, but like everyone who was even available to get to 3-1 had a 10-inch move flyer in their list, because it was just
Cockatrice,
so
Thundercat,
heavily weighted towards
gargoyles.
that. Yeah, because the ability to like run over and kill something every round was just so important, especially once they switched to 4 rounds but didn't change the stats on everything to be more survivable for 4 rounds. Yeah, being able to do that, there was no possible way to attrition, like to survivability attrition that out. And like you've shown with these very subtle shifts in stat changes, I think 4 rounds is a much more pleasant experience than 3, and they've gone ahead and made 4 rounds just make more sense with the stats than it did in 1.0, which is really nice to see.
Yep. And then, so again, props to you. This is an old video of yours. This is kind of going over your old 1.0 formulas. I know you had taken a lot of things into account. You had taken in, fighter abilities, movement, range, survivability, and had this, complex scoring system.
Yeah, I had at the time, I was really into the idea of just a single overall score to determine what is the best fighters in the game, just sort of as is. And I think in 1.0, I still stand by that approach, but the game has really changed in 2.0. For one, I had a projection score in that video. The nature of power projection is so different in 2.0 that I had to just completely throw that old formula out. It just wasn't valid anymore. And also, you've got something here about how I would have the importance of having roles in a list. I really liked the idea of being able to mathematically evaluate lists, given that we didn't have really tournaments going on in the pandemic. I think that being able to do that is a lot less important now, but I actually think that the thing that's trying to get at, of just having different strengths to your list, I think that kind of thing is even more important now than it was before, of having a list that can do multiple different things, right? That can have a backbone of things that just win one-on-one fights, and then also have a way to reach across the board. And those two don't necessarily need to be the same thing. Whereas in 1.0, they kind of could be, right? You could have your move 5 demonettes, or your move 6 plague monks. You could have those be your projection and your fighty bits. Now you can't really do that. I think they've done a much better job with the stats this time around, although, there's plenty we could argue about how they've pointed certain models, but I do think, in general, they've kind of made it so that you need to have different elements to your list now, in a way that's really cool, but also definitely makes my old project of having one final number to evaluate a model. I don't think that project is nearly as useful as it was when I first embarked upon it.
Well, it's you had mentioned tournament results, right? You can have a huge complex calculation. You can come up with an overall score for the fighters, and okay, this is my overall score for the warband based on certain metrics and synergies and stuff like that. But there wasn't nowhere near enough data, and I don't think there ever will be enough data to sort of validate that, right? Because it's Warcry being a small game compared to even like say either the big army games or Kill Team. You're probably never going to see like a MetaWatch article for Warcry like you see for Kill Team.
Oh, interesting. My hot take is we're like 2 years away from that. So I think we will one day see it.
In terms of it growing?
In terms of getting a MetaWatch article from GW. I think in 2 years, I think we'll have it. Because, I mean, think about the game 2 years ago. I mean, literally no one was playing. Well, I guess the pandemic makes it so impossible to do that kind of thought experiment, doesn't it? But
I mean, just fantasy is naturally going to be a subset of the 40K fan base, and skirmish is always going to be a subset of the big army game fan base, and Warcry is a so you're getting a fraction of the overall GW fan base. I'm not sure it's ever going to be big enough, or like does GW even care? Do they want to keep this as kind of like a semi-fun beer and pretzels narrative game?
They're pushing a lot of product for it.
They're pushing product for it, but like, where's our FAQ?
Well, that's a valid question.
I'm not asking for balanced data slates every quarter like we get for Kill Team, hands-on management like that. But where's our FAQ? Kill Team got an FAQ for their latest set, or for their Into the Dark set. And we don't have one yet, and there's questions we would like to get answered or cleared up.
I think that could be a whole different conversation, and we should talk about lists.
Yeah, griping about GW support, yes or no, is a rough rabbit hole to go down. Whether you're bullish on it or bearish, either way it can be rough.
Well, the big takeaway here, though, is, talk all the stats, and maybe people kind of zoned out already, but the numbers don't lie.
They certainly do not.
Except for when the abilities are more interesting than the numbers, but we'll talk about that another time.
Yep. So here I wanted to kind of just talk about, so if getting back, we're going to go back up to the high level discussion here. Maybe you're listening to us, you're new to the game. And we have seen a fair number of new people in Discord, and they're asking, "Hey, what's good?" And more often than not, now I'm saying just follow rule number 1, the rule of cool. Like, look at the armies, look at what you like, and go with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't disagree with you, but I will say that as someone that my enjoyment of a game comes from tuning and identifying competitive lists. That advice is not always what, for example, I personally would be asking for. People say, well, what do you think is cool? It's like, I don't care. Tell me what's good, and that's what is cool to me. Like, is identifying the synergies and the efficiencies and the ways to attack the metagame.
Well, I think so this is kind of my other point. So one of the things behind the rule of cool is the fact, like, if you think you're working on a cool faction, you're going to be into it, you're going to have fun building and painting it. You're going to probably spend more time building and painting miniatures than ever playing the game.
This is very true.
But the other thing is, if we kind of talked about this on the last episode, the way that the points are laid out in 2.0, all of the models are pretty much following the same point algorithm. It makes sense. If something is fast and tough and flies, it's going to be expensive. But you get what you pay for in pretty much every case. It's not like certain units just simply got shorted in the points budget.
Yeah, it's more about where they spent the points and how they weight the points,
now,
right?
Yeah, there's some units are still better than others because they spent their points better, right? You know, they only paid for 8 inches of movement instead of paying extra for 10 or 12 or something like that. But
yeah, that part, quick aside, 12-inch move, ooh, that's so rough spot to be in, given just how much 10-inch move is always the exact same thing on the actual board.
Right.
Yes.
Or you look at 3-inch move, potentially like maybe 3-inch move is maybe too cheap. We talked about that as well. Or maybe the combination of 3-inch move with the ability to boost your move by 6 inches from a movement ability. Maybe that's too broken. But generally speaking, you get what you pay for. You're not. It's not like you're be playing Iron Golems in 1.0 and just straight up like, yeah, your stats suck. Like,
yeah, good thing I paid for all this toughness.
Right. Whatever points budget we had, like you simply just didn't. You were last in line when giving out stats for points, and you just simply didn't get what you paid for. That's not the case in 2.0. And so you could do something like, hey, you want to play Pus Goyle Blight Lords?
I do.
Go nuts, man. I mean,
42 wounds.
Yeah.
And I also think sort of this is maybe branching a little bit off of what you're saying, but one side effect that I've found in playing quite a bit at this point is that because everything is sort of much closer in terms of the quality or just the blatant points mistakes are so much fewer. Abilities matter so much more because that's where you get the edge. When two fighters bump up against each other, to me the biggest edge isn't points mistakes. Now we can get into the couple edge cases where I don't think that's true anymore, but in general, when most factions fight most other factions, the edge isn't points mistakes. It's what are you getting from the abilities at your disposal and how much value are you creating for yourself with those abilities? So that I think that I don't build this way, but I think it's very reasonable to build looking at the list of abilities first and the fighters second.
That's kind of what I was thinking about with this whole theory of building.
Oh, is that your
list?
top down versus bottom up?
That's
Sorry,
the bottom up. Yep. Nope.
Great to hear. Awesome.
Great foreshadowing. That was kind of what I was thinking about with the whole bottom up list building theory. We'll talk about general guidelines, talk about top down, kind of the way that a lot of us built lists in 1.0, a new way of thinking about it, bottom up, and then also we'll talk a little bit about monster lists, which I think are their own kind of special case. So if you've been listening to us, seeing lists from us, or checking out Dan's channel, probably the biggest thing is having 3 legit threats, mid-sized threats, maybe 200-point threats, 1 per deployment group.
A little harder to do now than it was, but still viable way to build.
Yeah, and the thing I love about it, because it's harder than it was, I think there's a lot of ways to build that aren't that now. But if list building intimidates you, this is a great template to just do. Just what are my 3 favorite chonky boys in this faction? Just going to play them, and hey, I'll just fill it out with little guys. And it's just a great way to do it if the idea of kind of complex list building is intimidating to you, because it's always going to be viable. Not always for every faction, but like half the factions in the game at least can build a pretty reasonable list with this template.
Yep. And that's where some of these efficiency killingness models can be very useful. It's like, then fill in with your most efficient remaining model, right? Like find your most efficient things to pack in around the edges to fill out your points, and you have something that's not going to be like frustrating to play, right? It's going to be it's going to work, whether it works as well as what your opponent is doing, but it's not going to feel like it's non-functional.
Yeah, and kind of branching off what I think you were saying is like, okay, so yeah, this is a really simple template for someone who's scared of list building, like what I said, but then you can actually get really into the weeds of what 3 threats from my list should I have? Should I have the same one 3 times? Should they be playing different roles? And then, of course, the tight math hammer over what you fill it out with, which chaff to use when, whether you might put different chaff in different deployment groups, like all of that. You can get really into the weeds with this template, but you also can face roll it and you'll
Yep.
obviously lose some EV that way, but you can do it if you want to.
Yeah, it's a template and it's tunable. You can start
Yep.
with it, and then you can definitely tune it up to the optimal of that template. And we'll talk about this as we go on. There are some down here where it says mobility, for example, like there in 1.0, having a 10-inch flyer was really, really critical. And in 2.0, we're seeing a lot of lists that are not mobile in the 1.0 sense of the word, right? They don't have that at least one piece. They can go anywhere, anytime. And what are the pros and cons of doing that? The pros are that flying models got more expensive and you get more points efficient by cutting them, but the cons are you don't have that ability to pick and choose where to put this model and start fights. So these are list building considerations, which is good, I think, because in 1.0, if you wanted to be competitive, it wasn't really a list building consideration. It was you start there, right? And then you fill in around it because it was kind of mandatory if you wanted to compete against in all the mission types.
Yep. And one final thing here for the legit threats, it doesn't necessarily have to be one. That threat doesn't necessarily have to be one model. It might be a group of models. It could be like a Cryptghast and 3 or 4 Graveguard. We call them murder
Cryptghast
balls.
4 Graveguard is going to outfight almost anything it runs into, right? Whether it's one big model or a bunch of small models. So I would consider that.
Yeah, you could have a group of models that form a threat, or I have you could use a Skaven list, right? Yeah, 2 Storm Vermin backed up by a hero with lead from the rear might be enough of a threat to count as a legit threat instead of having just a single model.
And part of that's because support heroes they all went down in points by so much that none of them are among the top point for point fighters in the game, but they are way less just dead weight in your list than they used to be. And so that makes it so that absolutely a support hero plus 3 people getting the buff from that support hero becomes a threat in a way it wasn't before.
Yeah, and some of these abilities we're talking about are insane. Like you landed at the right spot, and you can just crack open a game. Lead from the back is one of them. The big movement buffs from Tempest Eye and Flesh Eater Courts. You can all of a sudden just have an entire deployment group full of undercosted slow movers, just like out grinding your opponent anywhere you want them. It's definitely a way to play it, and my lists lately have gone more towards that route than the 3 threats. But that model isn't necessarily dead.
Yep. It also increases your model count some. So I had an old graphic I didn't include here, but on an old 1.0 slide, right? I tried to classify like if you had back in 1.0, most of your lists had 9, 10 models, eight models. If you're going down to 7 models, I was a little worried. Nowadays, I think you're looking at lists and that your overall model count has dropped now from the list we've been seeing in 2.0. Have you guys seen that as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. And in a good way, I think it's really cool to see that you can get any amount of models. We've seen 12 model lists win tournaments. We've seen 6 model lists win tournaments. So I think that's really exciting. I do think model count by faction is important, right? Different factions have different model counts they should be at. Like when I see a 5 model Stormcast list or a 6 model Stormcast list, I get skeptical of it right away. I think, you really want to be at number 7 with Stormcast right now. But for example, there are other factions where, 6 is totally fine, or other factions where you really want to be around 8 or 9. So it really depends on what tools you've got at your disposal.
I'd argue 6 is fine for Stormcast. Five, I agree. You're probably putting all your eggs in one basket and getting too many fancy toys. But I think
And
6 is,
SCE just can't afford to have a deployment group with only one model in it.
Yeah, that's true.
yeah.
I don't even like the problem with 6 is you have 3 2 model deployment groups, and I don't love that either. Most of the time.
What are your 7? It's a 7 model Stormcast list though. You're taking a lot of basic dudes and or Griffhounds though. They'll have like maybe one hero, right?
For me, it's taking 2 support heroes. So
Oh,
like I
that's
love,
where you're saving your points on that.
yeah. So like I love that Norwegian player who did the 1 Tempest Eye hero and 1 Sylvaneth support hero,
Yep.
and got a ton of value that way. I do think, okay, I'm not totally against 6 model Stormcast lists if the reason you had to go down to 6 was because you included a prosecutor.
Yes.
Prosecutors are great.
If that's the reason that you're
That's
down to 6 models is because you have a prosecutor or a Thundercat, then that's okay.
yes, that's why I'm at 6. Actually, it was a list from Justin Smith. It was his initial take on 2.0 that I'm going to building towards.
Mm-hmm.
Three protectors, prosecutor, crossbow dude, and Lord Relictor.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable just because the prosecutor will do so much work that it's worth going down 1 for your model count.
And it's 6 solid Stormcast dudes.
Right. Whereas I've seen a decent number of people throwing together 6 model store, and it's perfectly fine to be like just, I'm keeping it casual here. I've just got these guys, but a lot of the sort of 165 point Stormcast guys, like a lot of those,
And my God, you have your choice of them.
right, you you really do. A lot of those just don't provide the value over the 130 to 140 point Stormcast folks that I want. And so there a list with a
Yeah,
bunch of them only gets to 6 models, and it's kind of a sketchy 6 models. You also have, again, like what Fred Shred's saying, man, by God, you have a lot of Stormcast heroes that are like 230 and up, but don't have a ton of movement, right? Like the Lord Imperatant, a lot of people were pretty high on it, just because it's so impressive on the board when you pull off the ability.
Yep.
I still love it as an ally for other factions, but in Thunderstrike, I kind of think it's a bit of a trap, right? Because you can't get to 7 fighters if you have a Lord Imperatant, and it isn't giving you that kind of mobility that a Thundercat or a Prosecutor gives you. So it kind of puts you in this odd in between spot where I just think it's way harder to optimize.
Yep. Kind of like how we talked about they having the critical mass of bodies for lead from the back actually is tricky as well. It's harder to get the harder hitting bodies in there to go with it and have the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know this goes more in towards bottom up list building, but I do think, yeah, you either want the numbers or Corn has a lot of profiles that really leverage 3 very effective attacks. And so I think you can go fairly low model count with lead from the back in Corn.
Yep.
Now
Well, yeah,
also you can go high with Corn because Blood Reavers are pretty solid with lead from the back too.
I mean,
But
if you get lead from the back on an Exalted Deathbringer, just on one Exalted Deathbringer, his odds of killing a lot of models if he's in range is very high. Like, and it just goes up from there, right? Like that can be like your floor. Like put them in the same deployment group, and like if I only get to pump him up, he's a Brugit on my guy that has this insane attack profile.
yeah. And he's
But
a Brugit who can cover the whole board too, because he's got 6 movement. So he's a Brugit who can run from one fight to another fight.
Yes,
If it's
that's the
one of
other thing.
those missions
It's
like
one of the
ley
reasons I
lines.
like the Death Master if you have the points for it, because he's so fast. But
So speaking of fast, well, speaking of, we talked a lot about efficiency and killiness already. You know how to kind of compute that now. You also kind of want to look at survivability in your individual models. And again, my selection is, I pick out the models, like the models I'm going to go pick up, build, and paint have already been kind of picked out on a list, and I keep a spreadsheet, and I just build a spreadsheet with those models, in my collection. Some combination of those. They've been kind of picked out for their efficiency. Haven't been culled or deselected because of your glass cannony, or maybe they bring some ability to the table.
Full disclosure, Warren is a big fan of 15 wound chaff models.
Yeah, I like 12 and 15 wounds for chaff. I think lower numbers are fine too if they're either like really cheap, like plague bearers, or wardens with the 3-inch. Wardens don't have to put themselves in danger to go fight you, right? So that can be really nice.
I like
But
my Arcanauts with pistols.
yeah, absolutely. I think Arcanauts are some of the best fighters in the game. I played them at Nova, and I did not regret it at all.
I think
But
your only problem was you didn't have enough Arcanauts. I list up like 10.
Yeah,
definitely did not have a problem. I love that list. I would run it back for sure.
The high side of model count, back to that, right? If you're playing, so it's part of the reason why Soulblight Gravelords is so scary. You have a high model count, so all these other war bands are kind of skewing lower in model count, right? Around 7 or 8, and you can have very easily put together a 12, 13 model Soulblight Gravelords
Very
list
easily.
with impactful models, and
Yeah.
you will feel that difference in the activation count.
So the one place I'm worried there. So okay, looking at the 6 match play missions, the ones like no quarter. Oh man, if you have a high model count Soulblight Gravelords list, you'll never lose no quarter because they can't clear you off of any of the corners,
No.
right? But things like Treasure Hunters, I think is the one, and Cursed Relic. I don't know how you win them. If you're all in on model count for something like Soulblight Gravelords, I don't know how you possibly win those missions against a really tuned list that isn't all in on model count. And then Reaper, that's the one thing where Soulblight has the cheat code because their ability takes points off of your opponent's point
Spiders
totals.
did the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, completely unfair.
Very unfair. Your opponent, when the first time you do it, your opponent just loses their mind. Like, come on, what are you telling me here?
Right, exactly. So, and it's really funny. Like, Scour and Raise, the Red Rover missions run to the other side. That ability doesn't take the point total off of them, but it does in Reaper, which is just so wild. So Soulblight has that thing where most really high model count warbands have a huge advantage in 3 missions and then a pretty big disadvantage in 3 missions. So it's, balanced, right? But Soulblight, they have that cheat code in Reaper that kind of makes them unbalanced, but you still have to figure out. I think if whatever event you're going to runs Treasure Hunters or Cursed Relic, I think you have to have like a specific plan for that mission. Whether that's I'm going to bring a Terrorgeist and just kill their treasure carrier every time. That's a reasonable plan, but I think you have to have a mission tailored plan for those 2 treasure missions.
So that
if you're
gets
gonna
back
run
to
that.
right. That gets back to mobility, right? You have to have some sort of plan for your mobility. Probably, again, like you said, right? Pick a treasure model, or if your faction has it, appoint a treasure, a fast mover, some sort of fast mover as your treasure carrier for those missions. And so you have to keep that in mind. So at least one fast mover for a good balanced list.
And it can't be off of a like Flesh Eater Courts or Swift as the Wind. thing to happen, because if you if you proc Swift as the Wind and then wait, well, then your opponent just takes the treasure, right? So you have to have your first activation be the thing that can take the treasure.
Yeah, it has to be naturally high movement.
Right. Now, it can be I pop Swift as the Wind and then I go take the treasure with my Tempest Eye person. But then your Tempest Eye ally has to be something that you're down to have holding a treasure. Or your Flesh Eater Courts ally. I think Cryptghasts are the best ally from Flesh Eater Courts in general.
Yeah.
But a Cryptghast is not an effective treasure holder. It's so killable. So I think there's a lot to kind of think about
There's a
there.
big difference between that and a Crypt Infernal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I used to love those Crypt Infernals. I had my 2 Crypt Infernal courtier lists back in 1.0, and I thought those models were so good.
Yeah, I would almost wonder about the horrors for that. I'll have to go look at their points, right? Just looking for something that lets you have a huge model count, but also is a decent treasure carrier. I'll have to take a look at those again.
Horrors aren't bad. I tend to go either super low with Cryptcast or go all the way up to like Arc Regents. But there's probably a middle ground there that's fairly effective. And we're kind of talking about abilities. The fact of like, look, if you're counting on using your triples every round to res a unit or whatever else, then whatever other triples you bring are not good, right? Like, because part of your core game plan is I'm going to be resurrecting a Graveguard every turn. Or like when I was playing Spiders, like the goal was to resurrect a Spider every turn starting round 1, right? Like you push up super aggressively and use triples starting from round 1. So you can't take other triples because it disrupts your core game plan. If you have a monster in your list and you're planning to drag and maul your way through the game, like your other triples are not good. And it can be frustrating because there's like, man, I really want to do both these things, but I don't have the dice. So you really need to build away from that.
And the one exception I would say is if you have different stages of the game in mind. So, for example, Swift as the Wind, you're going to be using it round 1 every opportunity you can get. Later rounds, you might not need it. So, like, I've found that Swift as the Wind and Fight for Profit, they don't really fight each other for space because you just use them in such different situations, right? If you're in a situation where Fight for Profit is interesting, then you're probably in a situation where Swift as the Wind is not interesting, which I think is a really cool dynamic. But yeah, you have to know at each stage of the game what are you looking to do, and then any other ability with using those same dice is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind, right? Like Fred mentioned, having a game plan for your, how are you going to play? How's the game going to flow? Like, what are you going to spend your doubles or triples on? But or even does your faction have good doubles or triples to use? So you oftentimes have to look at your faction and make sure, okay, yep, I do have some good abilities. I have some free movement abilities, or a blood from the blood god for a free attack or move on kill, or nets, or some of those other broken triples that we've been talking about. So you have to keep that in mind as you're building your warband and have a plan for how all that plays together.
Let's get more specific with the lists.
Okay, I just want to say one other thing about mobility. I know some people are like, "Oh, the mounted rune mark's bad." I've been on record as saying I think one mounted guy is probably fine for any list. You love the Varan Guard, and I do too.
I love the Varan Guard.
Yeah, for what it does. It's mounted, so a little bit of a drawback, but you can probably work around it. If you're running, some factions don't have a choice; they have to go to allies for this. I would be very leery once you get up to 2 or 3, you stand a much bigger chance of getting screwed by the terrain. Again, it kind of depends on what boards you tend to play on. But yeah, I say mounted, good way to get a fast mover. You're going to pay some points, but you're not going to pay as much as you would for a flyer with those same abilities. or even better, there's a couple models out there they're fast movers without the mounted rune mark, and those are especially valuable, right? Thundercats, Blissbringer from Slanesh, fast mover without the mount rune mark, or
I like
Torted.
The snakes from Daughters of Cain are move 7.
Yep. Yeah, the snake heroes are still really good. I think the snake rank and file have gotten a lot worse, but yeah, those snake heroes, even though they all went up 5 points, totally reasonable still.
Yeah, I like Daughters of Cain a lot right now. Actually, I have a lot of Daughters of Cain lists kicking around.
So kind of talk about, so the 1.0 method, we talked about this, right? You're going to pick your faction based on your top 2 or 3 threats. In 1.0, we didn't often have allies because they weren't as strongly endorsed by GW, and so you often times you're stuck within faction, and you pick your top 2 threats, right? Like, hey, I want to play 2 Crypt Infernals, and then you're going to fill the rest out with chaff. And if your chaff was good chaff, then you're more power to you, but you just filled it out with the chaff.
An example of this for 2.0 that I think still holds is something like Ogres, where you have a combination of really good killy top end units, and then you can fill it. You can still get like 8 models on the board because Nobblers are ridiculous. And I think you can totally build an Ogre list that's like a Crusher and a Gutlord or whatever, and like 6 Nobblars, if that's what you wanted to do. And I think it'd be fine. You have a lot of bodies, and wherever your Crusher gets to go, he's going to kill. It's something you could totally do.
Yeah, that's a good example. I think it's very hard to go wrong if you just pick 3 or 4 large ogres and fill the rest in with Nobblars.
Yeah, and you can get a surprising amount of bodies if you don't like spend a lot of time looking at ogres list. Like, Nobblars are so cheap, you can still get a reasonable number of bodies in there. Even like you play a Tyrant and a Gutlord, and that's like almost 600 points. You still get a bunch of Nobblars.
Yeah. Nobblars are a little worse than they were in 1.0, but it's still reasonable from just filling out the numbers and the rolls perspective, for sure.
Yeah, if you're like, they're not going to do anything, they're just burning activations so my Tyrant can get there and kill everything. The Tyrant will kill everything if you give him enough time.
Yeah. The one thing, though, that I kind of like doing is, oh, wait, hold on. You actually might be moving towards oh, okay, yeah, this is kind of a halfway in between. I think going for that old method, but instead just going, I'm just going to pick the faction with the best chaff, and then new soup rules just let me, make a mockery of any kind of fidelity.
That's exactly what I'm getting to. So the whole bottom up list building thing. So you mentioned, if you Graveguard or Arcanauts, right? Or some of the best chaff. You're going to build around that, and then you're going to kind of pick and choose your 2 or 3 big models based on the roles you want them to fill. Again, because since we're wide open now, you have access to allies. You could use a monster in this case. You could build bottom up with a monster. Thralls
if you don't like your chaff.
In Destruction Soup, right? You have some very good thralls there.
Yeah, I think that's that's like the current iteration of this philosophy is best encapsulated by the Destruction Soup lists. There's more than one way to do it, but you're like, I want my 10-inch flyer in my Hopper Boss. I want my heavy-duty fighter that's like a Rock Gut Trogoth. My good chaff is my Netters. I like their reaction because it's really good. And then I fill in my allies with whatever I need to round that out, whether it's even bringing in like a monster, like a Trogoth, or the Auric, the Iron Jaws Boar Rider, or something like that. And then you just have like a list that does what you want it to do. Like, it's not thematic. It doesn't make any sense, but it's very effective on the table.
Well, Gits are also another natural home for that too, because not only do they have the netters, but you also have access to Gobblepalooza in faction.
Yes,
So it
you
does.
don't have to
It's
burn
not. It's
ally
so, right.
slots.
So you're not
That's-
burning ally slots. Like you could take Gits, or if you have the extra points, you take what's his face, Boggle Eye.
Boggle Eye. I have a lot of lists that start with like Big Ogre,
Yep.
Squig Hopper, Brugit, and then just kind of fill in from there. But if you start with Gits, you don't have to burn those ally slots, so
Right.
you can still take, you have a little more diversity of models because you can get the Boggle Eye and the Gits or the Brugit in fighters, so you can take them
Yep.
both.
And when we did that list review, Dan, you were talking about you have all these good abilities. You have this huge toolbox of abilities to choose from as well, in that specific case.
Absolutely. And one of the cool things about double heavy warbands that don't care about triples much is doubles don't compete with each other for dice. You can always just basically, if you roll a natural triple, you can add a wild dice to it and you have a rampage, which those are always great. And as long as you have something that moves quickly, that makes rampage completely broken. And then if you don't roll a natural triple, you just don't use any of your wild dice turning doubles into triples, and you just spam like 4 doubles this round. I mean, you're not going to get 4 usually, but like it's pretty easy a lot of the time to end up with 3 doubles at your disposal.
I do that quite a bit. That's a lot of whip cracking.
And
Yeah.
we were talking about the Kellyan King Storm of Blows or the Varangard Relentless Killers. Like the fact that those are doubles is what makes them so good because you can have them whenever you want. Like if you aren't triple heavy, you can just burn those like every round. And that's something that I look at. And again, I wish I had played more 2.0, but on paper, I like those guys because I want to be able to like on demand get across the board and potentially bracket down a monster, right? Like you can get there with your 10-inch move, pop your big damage ability, and put a lot of damage where you want it, which is something that a lot of my lists are kind of focused on.
I also like the free move doubles where you get to have 2 attacks sometimes instead of just one, and then you can also
Like
you get to have
the ones that Fleshhounds have or Deathmaster.
right, and a lot of the times you're not paying the points for that movement, but you have it, right? So I've really enjoyed playing the Slankhorse Slakehorn, which is actually 5 points more than it was in 1.0, but I think is actually better, partly because its friends are better. The rest of Sybarites are so much better than they were before, but also partly because that ability to get around the board without having paid for flight is, I think, more important now than it was before.
Yeah.
Is that on a double?
Yeah, it's on a double.
Oh, that makes that Slanesh Chimera list even sweeter then, because we were using Slakehorn as the leader for that. All right. So we talked about, okay, you might want to, a certain faction might have a good chaff model, might have nets. Other factions with nets, we've talked about on Discord, Spire Tyrants or Unmade. You could use that as the backbone of your warband, and then kind of pick and choose, your heroes based on that. I know that Destruction Soup is the most obvious sort of example of this, but
the puzzle pieces fit together really well, right? Like there's a real natural fit.
But I believe that I think there's Chaos Soup out there as well, and I've said that your KO list, Dan, is kind of like order soup in a way.
Yeah, it's getting towards soup. It's a stew. It's at least a stew. Yeah, and then I think Sylvaneth's soup has legs because they're teleporting chaff and they're
that's
net chaff.
Yeah, that's something good you could build around. Yeah. So monsters are a special case. You could either do a top down because you pick your monster first and you kind of build around that, or you might want to do a bottom up build using some of the ideas from the bottom up, where you might want to take Spire Tyrants and build around chaff with nets and then top it off with a monster. Another guideline that we've seen in good monster lists is you want to have a good plan B to go with the monster. So while the monster is busy winning you the game, maybe something like a Slangor Slakehorn or a Abhorrent Ghoul King combined with a Cryptor to kind of clean up models that the monster isn't taking care of.
I like that. I also like, and you've got model count here as your next one, but just having so much beef that your opponent they can't actually kill your things while also worrying about the monster, right? So that's kind of my whole theory around Nurgle with chimeras is that you just can't kill plague bearers if you're worried about a chimera eating you. You know,
Yeah.
there's just too many of them and they're too tough for you to kill them. And I think
this
Order can do something similar.
This is an interesting point because I know initially the theory crafting we've been doing was the best home for a chimera would be a high model count list, because with your high model count you can wait out all their activations and then you go just ham with your chimera. You can attack uninterrupted against their monsters or whatever. But what we've been seeing in these successful lists is these chimera lists, they're successful regardless of the number of models.
Yeah, this is true.
Right. The Polish winning list was 6 models.
And successful regardless of whether they have a plan B or not. I mean, right. I think what we're really getting to is the chimera is just overtuned. And I think also people panic when they see it. I think in general, like at Nova, a buddy of mine, Jason, he's the person who took second at the tournament with a Terrorgeist. And this is nothing against the players who did this, but essentially he had 2 interesting matches and 2 where his opponent just kind of panicked and didn't play a real game of Warcry because, they just they were just rattled by this giant thing in their face. And I think that that's really helping Chimera players at the moment.
And that's what I was going to say is that, like, part of it is people don't know how to play against monsters, whether it's panic or whether they have a plan, but it's not a good plan because they haven't faced one before and it's all theory crafted and they're like, okay, I'm going to execute my anti-monster plan, but it doesn't work.
And there's no shame in that, right? There's no shame for your first plan not working, right? You haven't had a chance to test it yet.
And they do something so different. Like, they take up such a huge amount of real estate, and Dragon Maul is such a game changer of an ability that some of the things you think might work, you can blow up on your face. Like, you don't take into account the monster can just grab one of your units and throw it on the other side of that huge base, and now your forces split and your plan is all falling apart until you see it happen, and then you're like, okay, well, that keeping a buff unit like a support hero and a regular guy together to try to kill this monster didn't work because he just dragged and mauled the support guy away from the other guy and killed it. There's not a real clear angle of attack for something like a chimera.
Yeah, a buddy of mine in my play group, Avery, had the idea that the toughness 7 annihilators might line up against chimera as well, because a chimera can't one-shot kill them, and you can have a bunch of them in your list, and then your opponent is in a position where basically if an annihilator gets to attack the chimera, they also have really good DPA 4. So if they're all over the place, the chimera can actually find itself with some no-fly zones around the board. We tested it out, and a list that was specifically built to be anti-chimera against my Chimera Nurgle list that was not necessarily built to be anti-Stormcast at all, on a treasure mission, which should be hard for the monster list, it felt really even. It ended in a draw. And so if you're this was my first attempt, but it is a little worrying that a list specifically built to deal with the chimera. I was also having a Knight Arcanum, which can bracket a chimera from 7 inches away. that a list specifically designed to deal with it still only felt about 50-50. That worried me a little bit, but maybe I think people will figure out better ways to go anti-monster than that first draft.
I think people right now, for example, are overvaluing nets against monsters. It's good to pin one down, but unless you pin it in exactly the right space, it can still dominate a huge section of the board. So, I don't know if that's necessarily the plan either. But I do have to say I got to run, guys. It's been great. I could talk about list building all night. I love talking Warcry with everybody, and enjoy the rest of the show. And
we're gonna take. Well, we're gonna tag in and introduce Dave then. How's it going, Dave?
Hey, how's it going? You hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we hear you great.
We're about to wrap up, but we'll be talking about upcoming events here right after this. So you're just in time for that. But wrapping up here, we talked about your supporting cast in monster versus monster battles. You may want to build your list around nets to potentially like slow the monster down for a turn while your monster rampages, or something like that, or maybe have a monster killer to bracket something down. Again, I think if as the game evolves here, if monsters stay in the competitive environment, you're going to see people starting to try to adjust. I'm interested to see exactly what happens.
And these supporting cast battles, you could build your list around the game plan of, I'm just going to have my monster go at their monster. They're just going to have their little Godzilla fight over here, like this sweet picture you've shown. And then my entire idea is that my supporting cast is going to kill their supporting cast, right? You could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Or, there's these monster net lists, right? Not net list as in a net list, but lists with nets. These lists with nets, the idea could be, I'm going to try to lock down their monster while my monster kills all their things. So I think that there's some really interesting back and forth to be had in what you do with your supporting cast if you're interested in how these monster versus monster fights are going to play out.
And then one other thing I forgot to mention is, if you're running a monster, you definitely have to pay a lot more attention into your abilities, because Dragon Maul is very triple hungry. Yep. It means you're probably not going to have triples to do things like lead from the back. So just keep that in mind as well. That
you're going to burn your wild die every turn. Like, you're not going to be banking a wild die because you want to Dragon Maul.
Yep.
Return. If you're not Dragon Mauling every turn with the monster, you're not playing correctly. Is my opinion on it.
I think I agree.
But yeah, that's what we had to talk about, stats and list building. But now we get to see it in action. So if you live in the central Ohio area, you are in luck, because we got 3 events coming up, within an hour of the Dayton area. So first off, as the time of recording, this is about a week from now. We're running our next organized play event at Epic Loot in Centerville, Ohio. Taking some lessons learned from the last time around. We'll be using the match play missions from the core book. We'll still have monsters allowed for this event. And then we'll have an event next month as well, likely based on the results of what we see. I'll make the call there. But I'm giving people the warning now that there's likely, for the store championship in December, there's likely to be a ban on monsters. And so we're going to have to play some good, honest Warcry in December.
Interesting. So I'm curious, metagame wise, right? Because any event page can also be a list building page, right? Mm-hmm. Is your local meta as Stormcast heavy as the meta at conventions has been?
It is not. We've not seen. No, we have not seen Stormcast.
That's interesting. That's very relevant.
Against Stormcast ever? I don't think so.
Yeah, no one's ever brought Stormcast. We have 2 or 3 Khorne players.
It's very Khorne heavy. Khorne Mortals more. more
Yeah,
than demons.
Dan has corn. Dan has corn mortals. I have corn mortals, not built or played, but that's something I'm building towards. We had a couple. We have one Soulblight Gravelord player and someone else getting in. If he makes it, he's going to get in on the ground floor with Soulblight Gravelords. It's kind of. Yep. Sylvaneth. We've seen Sylvaneth. We've seen Beast of Chaos. If I'm playing as an extra, I'll be playing Untamed Beasts.
That's interesting. And corn, being known as the local corn guy or having multiple local corn guys, I think is kind of cool because the way you beat a Blood Warrior heavy list is very different from the way you beat a Blood Reaver heavy list. So you could be known as I'm the local corn guy, and you could be showing up like your opponents are still guessing, right?
Yes.
Your
Because
local opponents, yeah.
Because that faction is so wide. That's why I like it. Other people and I love they're such lovable idiots. But looking forward to this. Adding a little more formality to this one. And then so the week after we had three weekends, 3 events in a row. So this isn't our event, but our good friend Jolly up in Columbus is running a Warcry narrative event. Nice. Links are here. It'll be in the description as well. And so it's going to be more of a narrative tournament. I took a glance at the tournament pack. It's typical. The missions are given for the 4 rounds. There's some narrative elements where you can earn some artifacts, and there's some special abilities your guys can get in some story that he's written for it. It's some pretty cool stuff. So it's not following the core narrative rules like that narrative tournament at Nova.
Yep.
And no monsters, but you show up and you can bring up a full warband other than monsters. So you're not.
Yeah, is it like the 1.0 Fel Nyroth tournament in that it's a narrative tournament, but winning still there's still a winner?
Yes, there's still
right?
there's
cool.
there's still a winner, right? You're still earning points towards an ultimate, first, second, third place. But your guys can grow, they can get renown levels, artifacts or some artifacts are in play. And he's created and curated a list of artifacts for that event.
I think that middle ground place might be kind of the cutting edge or the future of Warcry. Or at least, making an attempt to kind of bridge the narrative and competitive where both can be played for in a given tournament, I think is a really cool idea. I hope it works out well. Yeah,
he check the Discord. He put it up for comments in the Discord. Is a kind of initial hey, what do you guys think about this? Kind of get the community kind of proof it a little bit. But that's out there. It's out there and it's public. So that'll be fun. That'll be fun. And then the week after, so we're coming down. So our first organized play at Mavericks in Mason, Ohio. So we've met there a bunch of times to play. But there's another pocket of players down there closer to Cincinnati. And so we're going to actually do the formal deal where we do the event, worked with the store, do the flyers and such. And we're going to show up with multiple boards, see who we get here. And so
really for Fred and I, this is our local store.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. So even though we're all Dayton Warcry Club, they're Dayton Warcry Club South.
Yeah. Okay.
It's odd Dayton. The Dayton broader metropolitan area.
Yes. Yep. The Dayton Metroplex.
Dayton Natty, I like to call it.
And so this will be a little bit less formal than what we're doing. Since this is the first one, the first meetup we're kind of doing there, kind of do some informal pairings. The way we do this, oftentimes, if you're brand new, never played the game, we'll lend you a warband. If you're an AOS player, just bring whatever. The rules are free online, right? You have all those resources. It's easy to learn. I spend more time answering questions, demoing and coaching new players at these events. So I get a blast out of this, and then I might get one game at an event like this.
That's cool. Being able to go, hey, I'll lend you a warband is such an awesome way to run an event. I'm really looking forward to trying to do something like that in the Twin Cities pretty soon.
Yeah, the Untamed, and again, I have those Untamed Beasts, and I mean they're solid, but I also like them as an introductory warband. I brought a buddy of mine who'd never played Warcry ever, to the last event, and he was actually playing most of the time. He was playing, and I was kind of like over his shoulder, be like, hey, think about this. And then I was off kind of doing something else, and he'd played the first 2 turns of another game, and then he goes out and tags me in, and I'm surveying the board, and I'm like, dang, you did a pretty good job. You're not in a bad spot here, right? So
yeah,
again, super newbie friendly game, and looking forward to getting more people introduced.
No, the odds are if you're an AOS player and you have like a full AOS army, you probably have enough for not just your warband, but a buddy's warband.
Mm-hmm. This brings us to a close for this episode of Dayton Warcry Club. We'll definitely be back to talk the outcome of all our events, plus possibly some short videos featuring certain lists we've built and tested. But one of the best places to see some of the latest lists we post and get help with your new lists is on the official Warcry Discord. A great community with a link in the description. And Dan has a community as well, potentially. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I've got a Patreon that if you check out my YouTube channel, you can join and join a Discord there. But first, I'd say, before you think about doing that, check out some of my videos. The last one I had before this was on the meta of 2.0. I've got one coming soon, hopefully, on the ins and outs of piloting monsters. So, yeah, if you're into that kind of stuff, check me out. I'm happy to do any kind of videos with ideas that people kind of look at my videos and go, hey, here's what you should do next. I'm always looking for more ideas, so get onto that channel and post a few comments.
All right, until next time, I'm War Machine.
See forever.
And I'm Dan. Thank you so much.
Yep, thanks for listening.
Hey
Today
there,
we'll
guys. Good to be here. I broke up your script already. I'm sorry.
Yep, you did. This will make the outtakes.